introduction of the book of Joshua.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. So through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died. Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after the victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14. Except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all of Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted from Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither." Which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan. Which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai. And they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan. And he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, the Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did, as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them are going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So, first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. Is that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all of the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything to breathe. But when you look a second time, more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later, in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 12. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham, that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail. Which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
So, kikita po natin na ito na yung pinaka-fulfillment ng promise ng Lord kay Abraham. In Genesis chapter 13, Abraham was there. In that exact land where God promised him to have. Ang sabi, naalala nyo nung si Abraham at saka si Lot nagkahiwalay? Lot chose the plains of Jordan at doon siya napunta sa Sodom at Gomorrah. But Abraham waited and prayed unto God at ang sabi ni Lord sa kanya, look northward, eastward, southward, and westward, all the land that thou seest shall be given unto you. At napari nga ho yun. Until today, hawak ng Israel yan. Nawala po sa kanila yan nung panahon ng captivity, and that is thousands of years. Israel as a nation do not have their land. Wala hong iba. There is no other people in history likened unto Israel. A nation that has existed without their geographical land. Nabuhay po sila sa iba't ibang lugar, waiting for the promise of return. And after thousands of years, just 1948, na ibalik sa Hudyo ang land of Canaan. Hindi pa ho lahat nakukuha, but that certain area kung saan sila nakatira, na ibigay po yan sa kanila. At ngayon, nakatiri po sila. Hanggang ngayon, may gera po sa Israel. Okay? Tungo muna tayo sa Book of Joshua. Joshua, as I mentioned a while ago, Joshua is the first of the 12 historical books. Joshua up to Esther. It forges a link between the Pentateuch and the remainder of Israel's history. Ito po ang nagdudugtong sa Pentateuch at sa lahat ng kasaysayan ng Israel. Through three major military campaigns. Later, pag-aaralan natin yung mga gera na yan. Bakit three major, Pastor? Central, Southern, at saka Northern. When they entered into the Promised Land, crossing the Jordan River, the immediate war was in the central part. Jericho, Ai, at saka yung Gibeon na nakipagbati sa kanila. Pagkatapos po niyan, they went to the south. And then they went to the north. Maganda po ang military strategy na itinuro ng Panginoon sa Israel. Okay po? Now, sabi dito, through three major military armies or campaigns involving more than 30 enemy armies, the people of Israel learned a crucial lesson under Joshua's capable leadership. Victory comes through faith in God and obedience to His word. That is the lesson that we can learn throughout the fights that they had. Victory comes through faith in God and obedience to His word, rather than through military might or numerical superiority. Hindi sa those things are basic. Siyempre, pag mas malalakas ang armas mo, pag mas marami ang army mo, it's an advantage. But folks, hindi porket may advantage, mananalo sila. Kasi during the time of Achan, they were on the, nandun sila sa vantage point. Andun sila sa kung saan mas marami sila, andun sila sa kung saan na mas makukorner nila, mas konti yun sa Jericho, and yet they were defeated because sin was in Israel. At nanalo sila doon nung naparusahan na ng death penalty si Achan, at doon po at pinakita ng Panginoon ang secret ng kanilang tagumpay. The title of this book is appropriately named after its central figure, Joshua. His original name is Hosea, but Moses changed it in the book of Numbers to Yehoshua. Yahweh is salvation. He is called Yeshua, a shortened form of Yehoshua. This is the Hebrew equivalent of the Greek name Jesus. Are you with me? Yung Joshua po at saka Jesus, parehas lang. Kaya lang yung Joshua, yun yung translation ng English, Hebrew to English. The Hebrew word is Yeshua, and in the English it's called Joshua. The Greek word is Jesus, and the English term for that is Jesus. But all in all, these names are the same meaning. The meaning of the word is God is salvation. Okay po? Yeshua is the Hebrew name of Jesus. Merong argument na may mga Christians na nagsasabi, hindi daw dapat nating tawagin Jesus kasi ang original name daw ay Yeshua. Are you with me? But hindi po. Bakit ginagamit natin yung pangalang Jesus? Because God allows translation. The New Testament apostles used the word Greek, hindi po Hebrew. Hindi po Hebrew ang ginamit ni Apostle Paul para tawagin ang pangalan ni Lord na Yeshua. Tinawag siyang Jesus. Ang ibig sabihin, ino-honor ng Panginoon ng translation. Ngayon, may mga church, pinapalitan yung pangalan na church, ginagawang ecclesia. Wala pong English word na ecclesia. Greek word po yun. So kung tayo magpapalit din, Society Bible Baptist Ecclesia, hindi po yun tama sa grammar. Kasi English po yung society, yung Bible, at saka yung Baptist. Kaya ginagamit natin yung English term ng word na ecclesia, which is word church. Okay po? So, yun po yun. Ino-honor ng Northern Translation. Okay po? Kaya yung Joshua, yun din pala ang pangalan ni Lord, Yeshua. Ano ho? Na ibig sabihin, Yahweh or God is salvation. Thus, the Greek title given to the Septuagint is Iesus Naus. Pastor, ano po yung Septuagint? Nung panahon ni Jesus, dahil marami na nagsasalita ng Greek, ang Old Testament na translate sa Greek language. Okay po? Ulitin ko po Nung panahon po ng New Testament, ang Old Testament po na translate sa Greek language. Ang tawag po doon, Septuagint. Yung po yung nag-translate. Sabi nila mga 70 daw kasi yun 70 na translator, translate ang Hebrew Bible sa Greek, kaya ko tinawag na Septuagint. Ang title po nung Book of Joshua doon ay Iesus Naus. Ibig sabihin po, Joshua the son of Nun. Okay po? Yung Latin title naman niya is Liber Josue, or the Book of Joshua. His name is symbolic of the fact that although he is the leader of the Israelite nation, during the conquest, the Lord is their conqueror. Ayan, yung kanyang pangalan ay paalala sa Israel na kahit siya ang leader, si Kristo o ang Panginoon ang nagbibigay ng panalo. Okay po? Kasama ko po kayo? Hello? Ayan. So, pangalawa, hindi man natin mapruweba, pero ang Jewish tradition, pag sinabi yung Jewish tradition, paniniwala po ito ng mga Hudyo na napasa na sa ilang henerasyon. Meron po sila mga scriptures, hindi lang po ba Old Testament. Marami hong Jewish writings. At sila po'y naniniwala na si Joshua nga po ang writer nito. And one verse that we can get is Joshua chapter 24, verse 26. Ang sabi po ng Bible, ready? Read. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone, and set it up there under an oak. That was by the sanctuary of the Lord. So we can find Joshua writing words in a book. Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. This refers at least to Joshua's farewell charge, if not the book as a whole. Joshua, as Israel's leader and an eyewitness of most of the events, was the person best qualified to write the book. He even uses the first person in one place, chapter 5, verse number 6. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people that were men of war, which came out of Egypt, were consumed, because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord sware that he would not shew them the land, which the Lord sware unto their fathers, that he would give us. A land that floweth with milk and honey. So ginamit ni Joshua yung first person pronoun na us. Okay? So makikita po natin dito na maaaring si Joshua talaga ang nagsulat po ng aklat na ito. Other evidences for early authorship are the detailed information about Israel's campaign and use of the ancient names of Canaanite cities. The book was written soon after David succored. Rahab was still alive. Sabi sa Joshua 6:25. Tingnan niyo po. Ready, read. And Joshua saved Rahab the harlot alive, and her father's household, and all that she had, and she dwelleth in Israel even unto this day. So the moment na nasulat po yung Joshua, buhay pa si Rahab, kasama pa nila. So hindi po ito later writings. Ang ibig sabihin, nasulat ang Book of Joshua nung panahon din nila. At kaya maaaring si Joshua talaga ang nagsulat nito. Now, Joshua divides neatly into 3 geographical settings. Number 1 is the Jordan River. Are you with me? That's the first 5 chapters on the west of Jordan, or on the east of Jordan. So, pagpasok nila, pag-enter nila ng promise na, nag-cross sila ng Jordan River, pero bago sila mag-cross, kung saan namatay si Moises, nandun pa po sila. Yun po yung first 5 chapters. Hindi pa sila nag-cross ng Jordan River. The second part is the land of Canaan, which is the west side of Jordan. That's chapter 6 to 13. And then the 12 tribes situated on both sides of Jordan. Pagkatapos yung number 3, buo na yun, nayati-hati na sa kanilang lugar. Ayan, so, ito po yung Jordan yan. Kung nasaan yung araw, ayan yung guhit na yan, itim, yan yung River Jordan. Okay? Andito sila somewhere here. Okay po, sa chapters 1 to 5. Chapters 1 to 5, dito namatay si Moses on a mountain there, at dito sila nakasettle. Ngayon, dito kinausap ni Lord si Joshua, you will cross Jordan River. Pagka-cross nila ng Jordan River, dito po nangyari yung mga fightings. Diyan nangyari, yung mga labanan dito tapos na, natapos na natin sa Book of Numbers, at saka sa Book of Deuteronomy. Dito yung dalawa lang naman ang kilalang hari na nakalaban nila dyan, sa Bashan at saka si Simon, king of the Amorites. Dito si Og, king of Bashan. Pagka-cross nila dito, dito na yung maraming nakaaway nila Joshua. Dito yung marami nilang nakalaban, dito sa side na to. Tapos yung last part ng Joshua, itong map na to, nahati-hati na sila. Binigyan na sila ng, ngayon may mga nakatira pa rin mo dyan ng mga Canaanites. Iniwan talaga yun ng Panginoon para sa bawat isang tribe. Meron pa rin silang battle. Okay? So, I hope naintindihan niyo po yung ating lesson sa kanilang map. So, next, tuloy po tayo. The book of Joshua can be divided into 3 parts. The book of Joshua can be divided into 3 parts. Chapters 1 to 5 is what we call the subjection, the preparation. Dito natin makikita na i-invade na nila yung land. Chapters 1 to 5, nagpadala na ng spy sa Jericho. Pagkatapos naman, doon naman sa second part, yun naman yung tinatawag natin conquest. That will be chapter 6, chapters 1 to 5, tapos chapter 6 to chapter 13. So, tatlo na chapter 1 to 5, preparation. Chapter 6 to 13, conquest. Okay po, conquest. Pagkatapos yung chapter 14, or chapter 14 hanggang chapter 24, yun naman po yung division. Yun na yung dinivide na yung land sa kanila. Yun na yung inheritance nila ibinigay na. So, simple outline lang yan ng Book of Joshua. Sa Wilmington, makikita niyo na invasion of the land, subjection of the land, at saka division of the land. Yan po yung tatlong part ng Book of Joshua. So, sa unang part po, so the key word in the Book of Joshua is the word conquest. Conquest. Okay po? Kasi makikita nyo sa entire book, ang pinaka-climax ng aklat, laban. They were in the promised land, but there were people living there. Do not forget this truth. Do not forget that the reason for these fights is God judging the people. Deuteronomy chapter 9. Balikan natin yung mga words kay Moises para lalo nating maalala. Israel is just being a channel of God's judgment to the corrupt people of Canaan. So makikita po natin sa Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 5, sinabi po, are you there? Yeah. Ready, read. Not for thy righteousness or for the uprightness of thine heart. Basahin niyo po yung verse. Not for thy righteousness or for the uprightness. Moses was telling Israel, hindi dahil mababait kayo, kaya kayo pupunta dyan. Hindi dahil sa sobrang mabait ninyo, kaya kayo may pabor. Kundi ang sabi ng Bible, but for the wickedness of these nations. Kasi sobrang sama na ng mga bayan na ito. Sobra po talagang sama. Di ba, lagi kong kinikwento sa inyo, nagturo ako ng ancient civilization. Grabe ang immoralidad. Sumasamba sila sa araw, sumasamba sila kay Moloch, tapos pinapatay nila yung mga anak nila, ino-offering nila, tapos
Tapos, puro mga sexual perversion ang ginagawa nila sa pag-offering, puro kalaswaan, puro kasamaan, puro pagpatay. Kaya ang Diyos, hinuhukuman ng mga taong ito, kaya sila papaalisin ng Panginoon doon sa land flowing with milk and honey. At sabi po dito, but for the wickedness of these nations, the Lord thy God that drive them out from before thee, that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remembering the covenant of God with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. Okay po? So yun po ang dahilan kung bakit sila gagamitin ng Panginoon para paalisin ang mga nakatira sa Canaan at sila po ang tumungo doon.